Picture this. It is 5:30 in the morning on a freezing December day in 1944. You're an American sentry shivering in a snow-filled foxhole staring into the pitch-black Ardennes forest. Suddenly, the ground beneath your boots starts to vibrate violently, yet there is no engine noise. The enemy has muffled the steel tracks of their tanks with thick straw, creeping right up to your front line in the dark. You were promised this sector was a quiet rest zone, a ghost front where the war was practically over, but in a heartbeat the sky erupts in blinding flashes as thousands of German artillery shells scream directly toward your position. You are instantly plunged into the Battle of the Bulge, a frozen, mechanical meat grinder that will shatter the minds and bodies of everyone around you. Declassified intelligence reports show a terrifying truth that was buried for years. High-ranking Allied officers actually saw the warning signs but arrogantly dismissed them as a desperate bluff. How did the most powerful military machine on the planet walk completely blind into the deadliest, most chaotic ambush of the entire war? Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To grasp the sheer terror of that morning, you must realize how totally unprepared the Allies were. By late 1944, the American brass treated the Ardennes like a giant, heavily forested waiting room. They dumped battered, bloodied divisions there to rest, and placed green, untested recruits right next to them. This fragile line stretched dangerously thin over 85 miles of rugged, seemingly impassable terrain. The deep ravines and dense pine trees tricked commanders into believing a massive armoured assault was physically impossible. But deep inside Germany, a desperate dictator was executing a massive, heavily classified counterstrike codenamed Operation Wacht am Rhein. Using the thick autumn fog and endless rain as a shield, the German military secretly moved hundreds of thousands of assault troops and heavy panzer tanks to the border. They marched strictly at night. They enforced a total radio blackout using only runners to deliver orders. American intelligence officers, sitting safely in warm command posts far behind the lines, stared at silent radios and assumed the enemy was broken. They were completely wrong. The trap was set, the artillery was loaded, and tens of thousands of young soldiers freezing in the dark were about to face an apocalyptic onslaught. The hands of the clock clicked to exactly 5:30 in the morning on December the 16th. In an instant, the frozen silence of the Ardennes forest is violently ripped apart by the deafening roar of over 1,600 German artillery guns firing simultaneously. Imagine standing in a quiet, snow-covered forest, and suddenly, the entire eastern horizon turns into a solid wall of blinding yellow-orange fire. The ground beneath the American foxholes shakes so violently that it feels like the earth itself is splitting open. This catastrophic morning marked the official beginning of the Ardennes Offensive 1944, a brutal awakening that caught the Allied forces entirely off guard. For the American soldiers stationed on this 85-mile front, the bombardment is a psychological nightmare. These are not all hardened veterans. Many belong to the 106th Infantry Division, a unit full of young green recruits who have barely been in Europe for a few days. They are experiencing combat for the very first time, and it is a baptism by unimaginable fire. The German artillery specifically targets the towering pine trees above the American positions. When high explosive shells detonate in the canopy, they create what are known as tree bursts. It is a terrifying tactic. The explosions shatter the massive tree trunks, sending thousands of razor-sharp wooden splinters raining down into the foxholes like deadly spears. There is nowhere to hide. The barrage lasts for over an hour, severing telephone wires, destroying command posts, and completely isolating individual American platoons in the dark. The chain of command disintegrates instantly. When the deafening explosions finally stop, an eerie, ringing silence follows. But it only lasts for a moment. Through the thick, freezing fog, an even more terrifying sound emerges. It is the deep, mechanical growl of heavy diesel engines, accompanied by the clanking of steel tracks. Looming out of the mist like prehistoric monsters are the German Tiger and Panther tanks. Painted in winter camouflage, they crush the remaining American defences under their massive treads. Accompanying them are hundreds of thousands of German infantrymen, dressed in white snowsuits, moving like phantoms through the trees. They bypass strong points, slice through the weakened American lines, and pour into the rear areas. The sheer scale and speed of this assault are overwhelming. The young American soldiers, outgunned and totally cut off from their commanders, are forced to make split-second decisions. Do you stay and fight an unstoppable armoured beast with nothing but a rifle, or do you fall back into the freezing wilderness? In these desperate opening hours, thousands of Americans are captured or killed before they even fully understand what is happening. The supposedly impenetrable forest has become a death trap. The illusion of an easy victory is shattered, replaced by the grim reality that the German war machine is not dead yet. It has risen from the ashes, bringing with it a winter storm of destruction that will test the absolute limits of human endurance. As the freezing fog thickened over the Ardennes, the sheer scale of the German counteroffensive World War II became terrifyingly clear. Massive columns of armour, spearheaded by 60-ton Tiger tanks, pushed relentlessly through the narrow forest roads, slicing the American lines into confused, isolated pockets. But the physical destruction of tanks and artillery was only half the nightmare. The real terror brewing in the snowy woods was entirely psychological. Hitler did not just want to shatter the American defences, he wanted to shatter their minds. And to do that, he unleashed a weapon of pure deception. Enter Otto Skorzeny, a towering commando famously dubbed the most dangerous man in Europe. He was the mastermind behind a highly classified mission known as Operation Grief. The plan was as brilliant as it was ruthless. Skorzeny gathered a special unit of English-speaking German soldiers. He dressed them in captured American uniforms, armed them with American weapons, and put them behind the wheels of stolen American jeeps. He even trained them to chew gum, swear like sailors, and hold their cigarettes the way Americans did. Their mission was not to fight on the front lines. Their mission was to slip behind them like ghosts and unleash absolute chaos. Imagine you are an exhausted American soldier falling back through the dark, desperately trying to find your unit. A friendly jeep pulls up out of the mist. The driver gives you a casual salute, points you down a dirt road, and drives off into the night. Hours later, you realise that road leads straight into a German ambush. These commandos were a phantom menace. They silently cut vital telephone wires, destroying communications. They placed red ribbons on trees to mark fake minefields, stalling major troop movements. And most devastatingly, they physically turned road signs around at crucial intersections, sending entire American supply convoys in the exact opposite direction of where they were needed. The confusion was paralysing, and soon, rumours spread much faster than bullets. Whispers turned into panicked shouts that thousands of disguised German assassins were roaming the rear echelons, plotting to murder high-ranking commanders. Total paranoia gripped the American army. Suddenly, you could no longer trust the familiar uniform of the man standing right next to you. To combat this invisible threat, American soldiers set up thousands of roadblocks, interrogating everyone with uniquely American trivia. It did not matter if you were a low-ranking private or a respected general. If you could not name the capital of Illinois, the winner of the latest World Series, or Mickey Mouse's girlfriend, you were immediately staring down the barrel of a loaded gun. The psychological warfare was so effective that the greatest threat to an American soldier in the rear was often another terrified American, proving that in war a clever lie can be just as deadly as a heavy tank. It is December 17th, the second day of the brutal offensive. Imagine you're riding in the back of a canvas-covered transport truck. You belong to the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. You are lightly armed, just a young soldier moving southward through a tiny snow-covered intersection known as the Bastogne Crossroads. The mood is tense but relatively calm. You've heard vague rumours of a German breakthrough, but you firmly believe the front lines are still miles away. You do not know that just over the next snow-draped hill, the deadliest, most fanatical armoured spearhead of the German military is barrelling directly toward you. This is Kampfgruppe Piper, a heavily armed SS unit led by a ruthless commander with strict orders to advance at all costs and allow nothing to slow him down. The illusion of safety shatters in an instant. German tanks suddenly crest the ridge, their heavy cannons swivelling toward your fragile convoy. High explosive shells rip through the freezing air, flipping transport trucks and setting jeeps on fire. Outgunned and completely surrounded by heavy steel panzers, your unit has absolutely no choice. To fight would be mass suicide. You and over 100 other Americans drop your weapons, raise your hands and surrender. You are roughly herded into a frozen, snow-covered field beside the crossroads. As prisoners of war, you expect to be moved to the rear, cold and defeated but alive. You stand shivering in the biting wind, waiting for instructions as the massive German war machine continues to rumble past you. Then, a single shot rings out from a German vehicle. Nobody knows exactly why, but it acts as a deadly spark. Suddenly, the SS soldiers on the tanks and half-tracks open fire directly into the crowd of unarmed prisoners. Machine guns tear through the huddled Americans. Men scream and fall into the blood-stained snow. You drop to the freezing ground, pulling the lifeless bodies of your brothers over yourself to hide. The deafening roar of gunfire lasts for several agonizing minutes. When it finally stops, the true horror begins. You hear the crunch of leather boots walking through the snow. German soldiers are wandering through the field, laughing casually as they shoot anyone who groans or tries to move. You have to lie completely motionless in the freezing slush, holding your breath, pretending to be dead while a pistol fires just inches from your head. Miraculously, a handful of men manage to survive this nightmare by lying perfectly still until the Germans finally leave, then fleeing into the surrounding woods. Their harrowing escape brought the chilling news of the Malmedy massacre to the rest of the American army. This brutal war crime did not break the American spirit. It ignited a blazing inferno of rage. Word spread like wildfire across the frozen foxholes. In that dark moment, the psychology of the American soldier completely shifted. There would be no more retreating and no more surrendering. The men fighting in the frozen forests realized that yielding meant certain death, forging an unbreakable wall of resolve right as the battle shifted toward a vital crossroads town. The fury ignited by the massacres in the snow hardened the American resolve just as the German war machine converged on a tiny, vital Belgian crossroads town called Bastogne. If you look at a map of the Ardennes, Bastogne is the hub of a wheel where 7 main roads intersect. In a dense forest covered in deep snow and thick mud, he who controls the roads controls the entire battle. The Germans desperately needed Bastogne to move their heavy tanks toward the Meuse River and ultimately to the port of Antwerp, but standing in their way was a bruised, battered and completely surrounded American force, primarily the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division. What followed was the Siege of Bastogne, a nightmare of endurance that pushed human beings to the absolute breaking point. Imagine being trapped inside a freezing, shrinking perimeter, entirely cut off from the rest of the world. The winter of 1944 was one of the coldest on record in Europe. The temperature plunged well below freezing, and a thick, impenetrable layer of fog grounded all Allied aircraft, meaning absolutely no supply drops could reach you. You're practically out of ammunition, rationing artillery shells and rifle bullets to the point where you're ordered not to fire until the enemy is practically standing on top of you. You're wearing thin summer combat jackets in a blinding blizzard, frantically stuffing torn newspapers and burlap sacks into your boots just to keep your toes from turning black with frostbite. Food is completely gone. Exhausted men are surviving on scavenged scraps and melted snow, constantly scanning the tree line for the next inevitable wave of grey uniforms. But the true, unfiltered horror of the siege was unfolding underground, inside the damp, unheated stone cellars of the town. Because the German encirclement happened so incredibly fast, the main American medical units and their crucial supplies had been overrun and captured miles away. Inside Bastogne there were virtually no surgeons, no anaesthetics, no penicillin and no sterile bandages. Hundreds of critically wounded men were crammed shoulder to shoulder on freezing concrete floors, lying in the dark as heavy enemy artillery mercilessly pounded the buildings above them, shaking the dust from the ceiling onto their bleeding wounds. The few medics left behind performed unimaginable miracles with whatever they could scavenge from abandoned homes. When the morphine ran out, they poured local civilian cognac down the throats of screaming men to numb the agonizing pain of crude surgeries. When the proper surgical tools were lost, they used sterilized pocket knives and household scissors. When they ran out of bandages, they tore up dirty bedsheets and old parachute silk. The agonizing moans of the dying echoed through the freezing pitch-black cellars, providing a haunting, unbroken soundtrack to this desperate stand. The military math was brutally simple and entirely against you. You were outgunned, heavily outnumbered, freezing to death, and bleeding out. The German commanders, sitting comfortably in their warm headquarters just outside the town, looked at the tactical map and knew the town was hopelessly doomed. They believed it was only a matter of hours before the broken Americans would inevitably surrender. By December 22nd, the situation inside the frozen perimeter of Bastogne had deteriorated from desperate to nearly hopeless. The American soldiers were freezing, starving, and rapidly running out of ammunition. The German commanders tightening the noose were absolutely certain that the breaking point had been reached. Confident in their impending victory, they decided to offer the Americans a chance to avoid complete annihilation. Shortly before noon, 4 German soldiers carrying a large white flag emerged from the snowy tree line and approached the American defences. They were blindfolded and escorted to a command post, carrying a formal typewritten ultimatum from the German High Command. The message was blunt. It stated that there was only one possibility to save the encircled United States troops from total destruction, and that was the honourable surrender of the besieged town. If the Americans refused, massive German artillery batteries were standing by, ready to entirely obliterate Bastogne and everyone trapped inside it. They gave the Americans exactly 2 hours to decide. Imagine standing in a cramped, freezing cellar serving as the American headquarters. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe is exhausted. As the acting commander of the 101st Airborne Division, the crushing weight of thousands of lives rests squarely on his shoulders. When his staff hands him the German ultimatum and translates its arrogant demands, McAuliffe crumples the paper in frustration, mutters a dismissive "or nuts," and walks away to deal with more pressing matters. Because his troops had been fighting so fiercely, he initially thought the Germans were the ones trying to surrender to him. When it was finally clarified that the Germans were actually demanding his surrender, McAuliffe had to craft an official written response. As he stood there pondering what to write, one of his staff officers pointed out that his initial instinctive reaction was absolutely perfect. McAuliffe agreed. A typist quickly drafted the official reply, centering it on a single blank sheet of paper. It read simply, "To the German commander. Nuts, the American commander." When an American colonel walked back out to the snowy perimeter to hand the sealed envelope to the waiting German officers, a moment of dark, historic comedy unfolded. The German major opened the envelope, stared at the single word, and looked up in absolute confusion. He asked if the reply was affirmative or negative. The American colonel looked the German dead in the eye and explained that the word was plain English for "go to hell." He then pointed them back toward their lines and told them to get moving. Word of that single word reply spread through the frozen foxholes of Bastogne like a bolt of electricity. It was completely absurd, entirely disrespectful, and exactly what the freezing paratroopers needed to hear. In the face of overwhelming odds and the constant threat of total annihilation, that simple phrase became a legendary roar of defiance. It told the massive German army that the men in Bastogne were not broken yet, and if the enemy wanted the town, they were going to have to bleed for every single inch of the snow. While the incredible defiance at Bastogne made headlines across the globe, a silent, invisible killer was tearing through the American ranks faster than enemy artillery. The winter of 1944 was the most brutal Europe had seen in half a century. Temperatures plummeted to near zero, and snow piled up in massive, freezing drifts that swallowed men whole. For the frontline infantry, the battle was no longer just against the German army. It had become a desperate, agonizing struggle against nature itself. This was the grim, unforgiving reality of Foxhole survival World War II. Imagine living inside a shallow grave dug into the frozen earth. You cannot stand up without drawing lethal sniper fire, so you sit in a cramped, hunched position for days on end. The supply lines are completely severed, which means you're wearing a thin canvas jacket and standard-issue uninsulated leather boots. When the snow inevitably melts against your body heat, it turns the bottom of your foxhole into a freezing pool of mud. Your feet get wet, and because you cannot move, change your socks, or light a warm fire, they stay wet. This constant, paralysing exposure to freezing moisture triggers a horrifying biological reaction known as trench foot. When your feet are trapped in icy water for prolonged periods, your body automatically constricts the blood vessels in your extremities to keep your vital organs warm. The circulation to your feet completely shuts down. The tissue in your toes literally begins to die from a lack of oxygen and nutrients. When exhausted soldiers finally had a fleeting chance to pull off their frozen boots, the sight was absolutely gruesome. The rotting skin would often peel away right along with their wet wool socks. Their feet were swollen to twice their normal size, completely numb, violently discoloured, and covered in agonising, weeping blisters. If the condition was left untreated in the freezing mud, gangrene would rapidly set in. and the only medical solution left was the surgical amputation of the infected limb. To combat this devastating invisible enemy, men had to rely entirely on each other. Soldiers were ordered to pair up in their freezing holes. They would huddle together beneath a single, stiff, frozen blanket, taking turns holding each other's bare, icy feet against their own bare chests. They desperately used their own core body heat to keep their brother's blood flowing. You had to brutally massage your buddy's feet, and he had to massage yours. It was a miserable, intimate pact of survival. The extreme cold infiltrated every single aspect of life. Your metal canteen became a solid block of ice. The meat in your rations froze so hard it could break your teeth. The plummeting temperatures even caused the metal firing mechanisms in the rifles to snap or jam when pulled. To survive, you had to endure a level of sustained physical misery that defies modern comprehension, fighting off the seductive, deadly urge to simply close your eyes, fall asleep in the snow, and never wake up. It is December 23rd, just 2 days before Christmas. Down in the freezing mud, survival seems entirely impossible. The brutal reality of World War II winter combat had heavily favoured the German offensive up to this point, using the violent winter storm as an impenetrable shield against Allied air superiority. But then, a literal miracle occurs. A high-pressure system sweeps in from the east, and for the first time in over a week, the thick grey curtain of fog and snow suddenly lifts. The skies over the Ardennes tear open, revealing a brilliant crystalline blue. The German shield is gone. Imagine looking up from your dark, freezing foxhole and hearing a low, steady hum that rapidly builds into an earth-shaking roar. Suddenly, the clear sky is completely filled with the unmistakable broad silhouettes of hundreds of C-47 transport planes. It is a breathtaking aerial armada. As they fly low over the besieged town of Bastogne, thousands of brightly coloured parachutes blossom against the pure white snow. It is a carefully coded lifeline. Red parachutes carry heavy ammunition, blue ones carry desperately needed medical supplies, and yellow ones drop thousands of pounds of food. For the starving, battered men below, it looks exactly like a sky full of Christmas ornaments, bringing the ultimate gift of life. Soldiers who had not smiled in weeks stand up in their trenches, cheering and weeping as the crates crash into the snow around them. But the slow-moving transport planes are not alone. Hot on their heels come the roaring engines of the P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings. These fighter bombers swoop down over the trees like avenging angels, ruthlessly hunting the German panzer divisions that had been pounding the American lines for over a week. Without the heavy cloud cover to hide them, the German tanks, even painted in winter camouflage, cast long, dark shadows on the snow. They are completely exposed. The American pilots unleash a devastating, relentless torrent of rockets, heavy bombs, and 50 caliber machine gun fire, turning the frozen forest into a burning graveyard of twisted steel and shattered armour. The hunters have instantly become the hunted, and the tide of the battle shifts with violent speed, and from the south, an even greater force is tearing through the ice to break the siege. General George S. Patton has achieved the absolute impossible. In the middle of a freezing blizzard, he managed to take his entire Third Army, consisting of hundreds of thousands of men and heavy vehicles, and pivot them 90 degrees to march straight toward Bastogne. Driving relentlessly through the freezing night, Patton's armoured columns crash into the southern flank of the surprised German army. By the afternoon of December the 26th, the lead elements of the 4th Armoured Division finally smash through the German lines, officially breaking the encirclement. The fierce paratroopers of Bastogne would proudly tell anyone who asked that they never actually needed rescuing. But the sight of those American Sherman tanks rolling into town meant the darkest days of the Ardennes Offensive were finally, mercifully over. By the first week of January 1945, the massive German salient that had violently bulged into the American lines was rapidly collapsing in on itself. Hitler's desperate gamble had always relied on two incredibly fragile conditions to succeed. First, the weather had to stay terrible to keep the Allied aircraft grounded. Second, and much more importantly, his armoured divisions absolutely had to capture American fuel depots to keep moving. The German war machine had launched the massive offensive with only a fraction of the gasoline required to reach their ultimate objective. When the skies cleared and the stubborn American defence at places like Bastogne and Elsenborn Ridge denied them that stolen fuel, the mighty German spearhead simply bled out and died in the freezing snow. Imagine you are a German tank commander. For weeks, your heavy Tiger tank has been the undisputed king of the forest, terrifying the lightly armed American infantry and crushing their defences. But now your engine sputters, coughs, and dies in the middle of a frozen, heavily bombed road. Your fuel gauge reads completely empty. You're not defeated by superior enemy armour in a glorious duel, but by a catastrophic lack of simple logistics. The terrifying armoured beasts that had spearheaded the invasion were suddenly transformed into useless 60-ton steel coffins. As Allied fighter bombers swarmed overhead, raining rockets down on the stalled columns, German crews were forced to do the unthinkable. They rigged their own magnificent tanks with heavy explosives, destroyed them to prevent capture, and began a miserable, humiliating retreat on foot. The once unstoppable German army was now trudging eastward through the exact same freezing mud and deep snow they had aggressively crossed just weeks earlier. But this time, they were being relentlessly hunted. The American infantry, hardened by unimaginable suffering and driven by a burning desire for retribution, pushed forward to reclaim every single inch of the blood-soaked forest. It was a brutal, grinding advance. The retreating Germans left behind millions of deadly landmines and fiercely defended every shattered village, forcing the Americans to pay a heavy toll in blood for every mile of liberated territory. By late January, the battle lines were pushed entirely back to where they had started before the December attack. The physical Bulge had been completely erased from the map, but the cost was absolutely staggering. Over 80,000 American soldiers were dead, wounded or missing, making it the bloodiest single battle the United States fought in the entire Second World War. The German army suffered over 100,000 casualties, losing irreplaceable men and machines they desperately needed to defend their collapsing homeland. The snow in the Ardennes finally began to melt, revealing a shattered landscape littered with frozen bodies, ruined towns, and the burned-out husks of thousands of vehicles. The greatest ambush of the war had ultimately become the graveyard of the Third Reich. When the spring thaw finally arrived in 1945, the Ardennes forest began to slowly heal its shattered trees, but the human cost of the Battle of the Bulge remained permanently scarred into the earth. If you visit the rolling hills of eastern Belgium today, you will find the Henri Chapelle American Cemetery. There, resting under the meticulously manicured green grass, are nearly 8,000 stark white marble crosses and stars of David. They stand in perfect silent formation, a staggering visual reminder of the price paid during those 6 brutal weeks in the snow. But while the dead found their permanent peace, the men who survived that frozen hell would carry the invisible wounds of that winter for the rest of their lives. For decades after the war, many veterans simply refused to talk about what happened in the Ardennes. They returned to their quiet hometowns across America, got factory jobs, went to college, raised families, and deliberately locked those terrifying memories away in the deepest corners of their minds. How do you possibly explain to a civilian what it feels like to hold a dying friend's freezing feet against your bare chest, just to keep his blood moving? How do you describe the deafening, earth-shattering roar of a tree burst, or the paralyzing paranoia of not knowing if the soldier walking down the road is a friendly face or a disguised enemy assassin? You simply cannot. So, they chose an enduring silence. But even in their stoic silence, the extreme cold of 1944 never truly left them. Families of these veterans often noted that long after the war, their fathers and grandfathers would keep the heating in their houses uncomfortably high. They would instinctively layer on thick woolen sweaters even during a mild autumn afternoon. They had miraculously survived the deadliest, most chaotic battle in American military history, but the phantom chill of that brutal Belgian winter remained eternally etched into their very bones. The story of this massive conflict is not just a lesson in military strategy or the logistical failures of a desperate dictator. It is an absolute, undeniable triumph of the human spirit over unimaginable physical and psychological adversity. It proved that even when completely surrounded, entirely outgunned, freezing to death, and pushed far beyond the absolute breaking point, ordinary people are capable of summoning extraordinary resilience. It leaves us with a profound, lingering question as we sit in our comfortable modern lives. If you were suddenly plunged into your own bitter winter, stripped of your safety, your warmth, and your certainties, would you have the mental fortitude to stand your ground? When the overwhelming darkness demands your surrender, would you break, or would you find the courage to hold the line? Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through one of history's most harrowing chapters. If you found value in these forgotten stories of survival, please make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the past. I would love to hear your thoughts. So please leave a comment below telling me which historical event we should uncover next. Until then, keep exploring, stay curious, and never forget the profound sacrifices of those who came before us.